Welcome to another edition of Global Conversations. My guests tonight need no further introduction on this show than telling you who they are. Vladimir Kozin from Moscow and Scott Ritter from the United States. Vladimir and Scott, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Regis. Great.
So, Vladimir, the first topic, and we're going to talk about two. The first topic is the INF Treaty. And then the second topic will be your analysis of the situation in the Ukraine as it is today. So, Vladimir, can you very simply explain, without going into a lot of detail, what that INF Treaty is, and when was it signed and by whom?
Yes. The INF Treaty, or in a wider understanding, Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, was signed in 1987 between the United States of America and the Soviet Union. And it scrapped two types of missiles, ballistic missiles and land-based cruise missiles of both sides, globally, everywhere, not only in Europe. But unfortunately, we have noticed that while initially the Soviet Union and later on the Russian Federation has not violated this treaty, and the Soviet Union actually destroyed all INF missiles, INF-related missiles by using explosive devices, or cut them into pieces. Probably Scott can confirm it or deny it. I don't know, because he was U.S. inspector on the spot of destruction of these missiles, I think, in the Soviet Union. Unfortunately, the opposite number, the United States of America, just put the number of missiles of that class, not destroyed completely, just changed the engines, and later on used this kind shorter range and medium range missiles as a target missiles to test efficiency of the ballistic and cruise missiles defense, not on computer but in real situation. And my role in this treaty was simply to understand who is violating it and who is not. And I counted that from 1999 for the next 20 years, the United States of America violated the INF Treaty 117 times, 117, while the Russian Federation has not violated it at all. We destroyed this kind of missiles completely. So unfortunately, while we are not going to resume the production of the same kind of missiles, we have noticed that the United States of America is thinking of resurrection of this kind of missile and to deploy them in Europe once again. Well, I don't know whether this plan will be implemented or not, but it is not very good announcement from Washington. Regis and Scott, I finished.
Okay, Scott, you take it from there.
Well, my experience with the INF Treaty was in the first years of the INF Treaty. I actually was I had the honor and privilege of being the first U.S. inspector on Soviet soil. I had deployed the INF Treaty had several kinds of inspections. We had what we call a baseline inspection. That's when the United States declares all of its missiles and Russia or Soviet Union declared all theirs. The baseline inspection went out and confirmed the numbers and the locations of all the sites, the factories, the operational units, and the missiles. So we did a baseline inspection. I think those lasted for 60 days, the initial period. Then after that, we have what we call the elimination inspections. And these were the inspections that actually went in certain areas and destroyed that which needed to be destroyed. Then we had the short notice inspections that took place where we could go in and do a surprise inspection, so to speak, of a facility if we thought something was going on. And there were some others. I was involved in a category called portal monitoring inspections. It was unique to really the Soviet Union. The Soviets ended up putting a portal in Magna, Utah, to inspect the Hercules missile production facility, but that was more or less just for reciprocity. The real issue was in Votkinsk, where they produced a number of these missile systems, in principle the SS-20, which was a road mobile intermediate missile, 3 warheads. But they also produced an ICBM called the SS-25, or the Topol, again, road mobile. And late in the negotiating process, the Russians told their American counterparts that, hey, the first stage of the SS-20 and the first stage of the SS-25 are pretty much the same thing. The difference is the second stage. There's some differences there, but because the first stage is the same, that would become an accountable item under the treaty. So how do we verify that Russia isn't covertly producing SS-20s and calling them SS-25s? So we had to create portal monitoring. We went to the Votkinsk factory and we set up a portal at the only gate out of the factory, where we carried out a series of inspections using different techniques and technologies to verify that the SS-25s that were coming out weren't in fact SS-20s. A very complex operation, but it gave us tremendous opportunities that the other inspectors didn't have. For instance, we lived in the Soviet Union and we interacted with the local citizens and the factory workers. And in doing so, we developed, I can say, as somebody who grew up in the Cold War and was attuned to be distrustful of Soviets and to think ill of Soviets and to assume ill intent on the part of. So you realize they're just human beings like us. They got the same goals, aspirations. They care about the same thing. So it was a greatly humanizing process, and it took place in the time of perestroika. So we got to watch firsthand the very difficult transition that Russia made from, the planned economy of the Soviet times to, what Gorbachev wanted but never was able to achieve, some sort of perestroika or restructuring. So that was fascinating. I also participated in a kind of inspection called the RDE inspection, the radiation detection experiment. The Russians, when they deployed the SS-25, the Soviets, had these facilities, these operation bases that had these garages that the missiles were stored in and such. And when the SS-20s were destroyed, these garages were supposed to be blown up because that was a facility. But the Russians said, or the Soviets said, hey, if we wanted to convert these to SS-25s, could we do that? So, and how would we do that? So the decision was made that yes, if you wanted to convert an SS-20 base to an SS-25, you could do that. But you had to let inspectors in to do what's called an RDE, or radiation detection inspection. And basically, we measured the neutron flux on the warhead, because the SS-25 had a single warhead, the SS-20 had 3 warheads. Mm-hmm. So while the SS-20 was still a missile, we carried out collection data inspections of that to get a database, and then we did one of the SS-25. And then we'd go to these bases and we'd do an inspection of each missile to confirm that the radar, the radiation or the neutron flux was consistent with an SS-20, not an or an SS-25, not an SS-20. And again, that was fascinating because I got to go to an operational missile base of the Soviet Union, missiles they were targeting against my country, and meet the guys that if we were going to go to war, we're going to push a button to kill my fellow citizens, and realize that they're not evil, that they're just military professionals like I was. They were doing a job. And I think everybody was grateful for the job we were doing to get rid of an entire class of nuclear missiles that were destabilizing Europe, putting the United States and the Soviet Union on a razor-thin edge of the potential of conflict that, had it occurred, would have ended the world. Mr. Kozin and I, I know we don't think ourselves as heroic or anything, but you know what? We were involved in a heroic process, a process that made the world safer. And it's a process that shouldn't have ended with the demise of the INF Treaty. The situation we're in today, where there is no treaty-based mechanism to contain the proliferation of a destabilizing weapon, is actually replicating almost in an identical fashion what occurred in the late 1970s and in the 1980s in Europe, where the SS-20 was introduced, then the Pershing and the ground launch the ground launch cruise missile was introduced as a counter, but except reversed. It's the United States now that's introducing the most destabilizing weapon. We're talking about not just Dark Eagle, this hypersonic missile that we're going to allegedly introduce into Germany later this year, but also these two so-called anti-ballistic missile facilities in Poland and Romania use a system, the Mark 41, which can be used not only to fire the SM-3 anti-missile missile, but the Tomahawk sea launch missile now becomes a ground launch missile. America always denied it. Russia said, hey, that Mark 41, we think it's in violation of the INF Treaty because it has dual use capability that's prohibited by treaty. Oh, no, it's only a matter of electronics. Don't worry about it. Less than a month after we got out of the treaty, we fired a cruise missile from it. We were lying the whole time. Now we've also gone and modified the SM-3 to call it the SM-6 Typhoon, which makes it a surface-to-surface missile fired from the same launch canister. So if I'm a Russian now, I look at these two facilities in Poland and Romania, and they're not just a ballistic missile defense capability, which is problematic in its own right, but it has the ability to launch offensive weapons, either a cruise missile, which is capable of precision strike deep inside of Russian territory, or the Typhoon, which is capable of hitting Moscow within 7 minutes of launch. And I can't imagine any American that would say, I would accept a situation where the Russians could fire a precision conventional munition or a precision nuclear missile that could strike Washington, D.C. in 5 to 7 minutes of being launched. It would be unacceptable. And yet we're doing this to the Russians. So I'm not a Russian, I can't speak for them, but if I were, I'd have to respond in kind. I'd have to create a capability of similar nature so that Europe now lived under the constant threat of having their capital cities annihilated within 5 minutes of launch. And it has to be quick. Now what happens? If there's an accident, a mistake is made, or something occurs that's misled, you only have 5 minutes to figure it out. Because if you're wrong and you say, well, maybe it's a mistake, boom, you're dead. You have 5 minutes, which probably means they're going to err on the side of we're not taking any chances, launch. So a mistake happens, it's misconstrued as launch, a launch is made in retaliation, we now have a general nuclear war. This is a very, very dangerous situation, and it only points out that we need a new INF treaty. We need younger versions of Scott Ritter and Mr. Kozin running around saving the world and saving their own countries from the folly of thinking these kind of missiles bring stability and peace. They don't. Instability and global annihilation is the only thing they offer.
Scott, let me ask you one question before we go back to Vladimir. Why and how were you chosen for this mission? This is really kind of extraordinary.
It was the biggest mistake the United States Marine Corps and the Department of Defense ever made. I graduated college with a degree in Russian history, specialized in military history. I took 2 years of college level Russian. Anybody who knows that under the best of circumstances, I might be able to ask you, how the weather is this morning. But I played football and drank beer at the same time. So my Russian was actually very diminished. It wasn't very good. But, and I was a very junior officer. I started as a first lieutenant. When I first started inspecting in Russia, in the Soviet Union, I was a first lieutenant. The most junior officer that was supposed to be brought into the on-site inspection agency, which is the Department of Defense activity, was a major. But when the Marine Corps went through its roster of available Russian-speaking personnel, they had no majors available. They had no captains available. The only name that came out of the database was First Lieutenant Scott Ritter, who's with the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines in 29 Palms, California, running around shooting artillery. They said, nope, you got to stop training to kill Russians, and we're going to send you over there to hug them and disarm. And they picked me to do this job. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had. But the notion that I was uniquely qualified for this job is absurd. I was a combat intelligence officer whose skill set was strictly related to maneuver warfare and closing with and destroying the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver. The last thing I knew anything about was ballistic missiles, knew nothing about missile production. I knew nothing about arms control treaty, and I for darn right couldn't speak Russian worth a damn. So I got picked for this job, but I'd like to believe that I grew into the job, and by the time I left, I believe that I contributed in a significant way to the accomplishment of the disarmament tasks that we were assigned.
Yeah. How long were you in that job and visiting in the Soviet Union?
Well, I started the job in February of 1988. The inspections began on July 1st of 1988. But I was sent to Votkinsk as part of what we call the advance party. So on June 14th, myself and 4 other American, we couldn't call ourselves inspectors at the time, so we were specialists. We traveled to Votkinsk, and we worked with the Votkinsk machine building plant, the Votkinsk factory, to prepare the site and the town and everything for receiving 30 Americans who were now going to be living in Votkinsk permanently on a rotational basis, but there was going to be a permanent presence of 30 Americans in a city that had previously been closed to foreigners. I mean, that's just a fascinating thing in its own right. The Soviet citizens of Votkinsk suddenly woke up one day and you got 30 Americans who are normally classified as enemy number 1, now living in their city, because we were supposed to live in a housing area outside of the factory, but that wasn't going to be built for a while. So we lived in an apartment complex in downtown Votkinsk, and we were allowed to walk freely in the inner part of the city. So in our off time, we would just walk through the city, meeting people, saying hi to people, going in and buying bread and cakes and clothes shopping for our families and all. And they just, at first, we were looked at like straight, but soon it was just like, yep, there's another American. Hey, how you guys doing? I mean, it was the greatest experience in the world. I really, really enjoyed it. It's been now more than 30 years, and I can tell you this, the friendships that I developed in Votkinsk, both in terms of my fellow Americans and the Russians there, are lifelong friendships. That you can't always say that about life experiences. You develop a friendship, but then when you go away, but the camaraderie that was developed through that unique period of time, the first 3 years of the inspections, brought everybody together so close. Even the Soviets. I mean, because this was a joint effort. This wasn't the Americans coming in by themselves creating this. This was working with factory workers and such to build something in a cooperative fashion to implement a treaty that both parties agreed needed to be done. And so the teamwork between American and American, and then American and Soviet was unique. It was wonderful.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Scott. Really fascinating. I think a lot of people are going to be very surprised. Vladimir, coming back to you now, tell me a little bit more about your specific role. Why were you chosen? And what were your thoughts in relation to what Scott was relating?
Yeah, Regis, nobody has chosen me in this particular domain, like analyzing development of nuclear weapons of various kinds. I selected myself to do this job because after finishing my doctoral thesis dissertation, I decided to study nuclear weapons, mainly of the United States of America. I wasn't a military man. I finished Reserve Officers Training Corps as the first lieutenant, and then was called to the Soviet Foreign Ministry, and that's why I didn't serve in the Soviet or Russian armed forces. I started studying with the strategic offensive nuclear arms of the United States, and contributed a number of books. But when the INF Treaty was approaching to 30th anniversary of its signing and enacting, I contributed this kind of book. Do you see it?
Yes, yes.
Yes, yes. And then this. Well, it's 200 pages. It's, I have a Russian version, and this is English version. And this book was devoted to, as I said, to commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the signature of the INF Treaty. And afterwards, I also examined in a number of monographs the evolution of the U.S. Strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, as well as the INF. And I share concern expressed by my colleague Scott that in the nuclear age there could be miscalculation, misunderstanding, and tragic accidents, technical failure, whatnot. And we can, as the giant nuclear powers, we can exchange nuclear arms very easily without even liking to do this kind of job, because we together, first Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev subscribed to the American formula that nuclear wars cannot be won. That's why they cannot be started. They cannot begin. And we reiterated recently by the nuclear P5, permanent members of the UN Security Council. It's also good that we repeated it. Unfortunately, the Republican President Donald Reagan decided to withdraw from the INF Treaty on the 2nd of August 2019. And the treaty is dead, and we are having free hands to do whatever we can with the INF missiles, shorter range and medium range. But this issue has not been resolved yet. And Moscow and Washington are having 13 unresolved issue in arms control. And especially after the Ukrainian crisis, it's difficult even to resume this kind of negotiations, but they are necessary to be debated in the frank and in a constructive atmosphere, because we have gotten information that our opposite number across the Pacific and across the Atlantic Ocean is engaged in producing INF-related new missiles, also nuclear-tipped and conventional tipped, to be deployed both in Europe and in Asia-Pacific. And that's not good, because we are still confronted with US tactical nuclear capabilities. And the danger with them is that true, they can be tactical nuclear weapons delivered by medium-ranged interceptor bombers produced in the United States. But as soon as tactical nuclear weapons will be loaded upon strategic heavy bombers related to strategic offensive arms, they will immediately be converted and regarded as strategic weapon, because in our nuclear arms control, Washington and Moscow rely upon only one criteria determining what is shorter or medium-range missile or tactical nuclear bombs or strategic nuclear capabilities. It's a distance of delivery systems, not the yield, not the crater or whatnot, or radioactive contamination of the environment, only distances. But we put this question once again in mid-December last year to both, addresses, the United States of America and NATO alliance, to remove all tactical nuclear weapons deployed on foreign territories, on foreign countries, to the continental USA. We do not have tactical nuclear capabilities outside the Russian Federation, only on our soil. But unfortunately, we have not got a very positive reply from Washington. And there is one more thing I would like to add. This Baltic air policing operation conducted by NATO from March 2004, initially in the sky of 3 Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia, and later on Poland was added to this operation. And this operation has dual capable aircraft capable of carrying conventional bombs and nuclear tipped bombs. And there is a great concern amongst Russian strategic planners and military and political leaders that the newly developed nuclear bomb B6112 from B61 families will appear in upcoming May in Europe and will threaten us. So it's very close. A Baltic air policing operation is conducted 24 hours a day and 7 days a weekend, all year round. Unfortunately, this issue has not been resolved yet, but we are hopeful that we put our fingers crossed that somewhere in the future we will encounter each other and try to resolve all these issues and downsize also strategic offensive nuclear arms. I hate abbreviation SOA because it hides nuclear component. So strategic offensive nuclear arms should be made in Russian SNV or SOA in English, because people don't understand what does it mean SOA or SNV in the Russian language. So a lot of work to do. 13 unresolved issue in many fields. I can enumerate them all. And I personally I'm personally of opinion that by the year 2045, the centenary of employment of 2 atom bombs versus Japan, the world community, the world at large, including 9 de facto and de jure nuclear powers, 9 of them, could eliminate all tactical nukes for good, forever, without a chance to reinvent and to reproduce them. Because we can rely upon conventional systems, hypersonic systems with pinpoint accuracy. Well, they are definitely also very dangerous, but nevertheless, it will be not so harmful because they are not classified as WMD, like weapons of mass destruction or weapons of mass annihilation. But nevertheless, this is a very long way to Tipperary, long way to denuclearized home. Regis?
Well, I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back to Scott, and I'll ask you both this question. Scott, you can comment on anything Vladimir said, obviously, but how did we get to where we are today from where we were in 1987? Scott?
Well, I mean, you can't just pick 1987. You have to go back to 1945 and the original decision by the United States, A, to develop a nuclear weapon, and then B, use a nuclear weapon. the development of a nuclear weapon, I can forgive my country for developing a nuclear weapon, because at the time, there was, especially when we were starting, there was concern that Germany might develop a nuclear weapon, and that had we allowed Germany to develop this in isolation, and we didn't have a response, that they could leverage that into, intimidating people away from, the destruction of Nazi Germany. Okay, so we built it, but then when the time came to use it, Germany was gone, defeated, and the only nation left was Japan. They were defeated. I mean, they were literally a nation ready to surrender. They were putting out feelers on how to bring this war to an end. They were, the only thing that was left was the conquest of mainland Japan, and the Japanese were indicating they were willing to stop the war, so that we wouldn't have to sacrifice 1 million Americans on the shores of Japan. But instead, the decision was made to drop not 1 but 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. Why? And I think the reason comes out when you start reading the records. It was more about intimidating the Soviet Union, to show, because there was a lot of concern that Roosevelt had given away the farm in Yalta in negotiations with Stalin. And now with Roosevelt dead, Truman in, the question now is, how do you do this? Potsdam was unsatisfactory for the Americans in the way that Europe was being divided. So I think Truman made a decision to drop the bomb to intimidate the Soviet Union. And from that point on, you create this cycle. I mean, now that we have a bomb that we've dropped, the Russians knew it, the Soviets knew everything. They knew about the bomb. They knew about the development. Beria was overseeing his own development of a Soviet counter. So we begin this nuclear arms race, where, as we develop, the Soviets respond. We get a hydrogen bomb. They get a hydrogen bomb. We put it on they put it on a big missile. We put it on the Minuteman. They find a missile that can strike the Minuteman. We find a missile that can strike and this cycle goes out of control. And then what happens is, first of all, America becomes addicted to nuclear weapons. And I think the Soviet Union became addicted to nuclear weapons. Once you have it, it becomes an integral part of your national strategic thinking. And you feel incomplete without this nuclear component, especially when your enemy number 1 has nuclear weapons, and then China gets them, and I mean, so the proliferation creates a problem. But the United States especially becomes addicted to it, not simply in terms of our strategic posture, but also economically. This is something that Dwight Eisenhower warned about. He talked about the development of the military-industrial complex as it relates to congressional legislation, the budget. And you get these nuclear laboratories, you get these industrial capabilities to produce and sustain nuclear capability, and the civilian component of America becomes addicted to it. New Mexico, you can't become a senator in the state of New Mexico unless you support continued active development of nuclear weapons. So right off the bat, 2 senators will never support nuclear disarmament because it impacts the economic well-being of their state. California is the same. Texas has so we've spread our nuclear infrastructure out so that all the key states have some component of nuclear weapons production and sustainment capability that, if denied, would deny the state jobs, high-paying jobs with well-qualified technicians, et cetera. So we're addicted to these weapons. Now, we recognize the dangers of these weapons. We created the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, for instance, in 1972, I think it was signed, because we realized that we were in this arms race that was getting out of control. And so how do you stop it? We just draw the line and say, mutually assured destruction. I use nukes, you use nukes, we all die, we agree, it's stupid. And the best way to agree that we all die is we don't pretend that we have defenses that are against them, because we knew that all the defenses did is make them build a better missile to hit us. And if they had a defense, we build a better missile to hit them. So we said, no defenses. Our missiles, the way they are, is what we're going to get. Then we got into the strategic arms limitation talk, how to not reduce the numbers, but to slow the spread in the types of missiles. And then INF came along. And INF was the first time that the elimination of nuclear weapons as a class was mentioned, I think, was in Reykjavik in 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev. But the United States wasn't able to do that because we were addicted to the Strategic Defense Initiative and weren't willing to agree to a certain limit, et cetera. But INF Treaty came, and both sides were wise enough to sign this treaty. But the treaty didn't eliminate the addiction to nuclear weapons. We still had nuclear weapons. Now, it reduced the appetite, though. We had now, the follow-on to INF was START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. And there we had great potential. But that potential only mattered if we treated the Russians/Soviets as our equals. I mean, that's what made the INF Treaty work, was the reciprocity, the equality, the fact that when I looked at my Soviet counterpart and they looked at me, we were equals in the eyes of the treaty. The treaty didn't discriminate between one side and the other. But then the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States stopped viewing Russia as a peer, as an equal. We started viewing them as an inferior, and we didn't take their strategic considerations into account. And we started acting like a unilateralist bully, where we could develop things because we said it's good for our defense, good for our security. But what if the Russians are offended by it? Don't worry about the Russians. They're nothing now. We don't need to worry about the Russians. So we started to pull away where reciprocity was no longer an issue. Now, and we didn't feel threatened by it because we're like, well, the Russians don't have anything that we have to worry about anyways. It's a failed state. We're going to exploit them economically. They're going to fall in love with the dollar, and they're going to voluntarily disarm, and we'll just dominate the world. That might have worked during Boris Yeltsin's time period, but then somebody came in 1999 who drew a line and said that ain't going to happen anymore. Vladimir Putin, and Russia started, rightfully so, demanding respect, demanding reciprocity, demanding to be treated as an equal, as a nuclear power, and demanding arms control agreements that reflected this. And the United States was not able to respond because we were unable to view Russia as our equal. Even to this day, we're not willing to admit that Russia is our equal. But on nuclear weapons, again, we became addicted to these weapons, irresponsibly so, and we forced the Russians to respond in kind. I mean, one of the great speeches of all time, not because I like what he was saying, but because of its relationship to history, is Vladimir Putin's address, I think in March of 2018, where he unveiled new categories of weapons. But you listen to that speech and he talked about the consequences of American action, talked about the withdrawal from the ABM Treaty, the withdrawal from the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, how we had disdain for INF, disdain for open skies, and therefore Russia had no choice but to produce these weapons. And he said, the reason why we produce these weapons is you never listened to us. We talked to you, but you never listened. And then the phrase that always gets me, are you listening now? And the answer is no, we didn't listen. We should have, but we didn't. We do stupid things. For instance, that's a wake-up call. That doesn't mean that we roll over and surrender. No, it means we sit down with the Russians and say, hey, what the heck are we doing here? This is bad stuff, bad juju. How do we, if you go this way, we're going to have no choice but to do this. Let's rein this in before it gets out of control. But instead, we developed the low-yield nuclear warhead that we put on a Trident submarine floating off the coast of the Baltics, where the Secretary of Defense personally carries out an exercise where he pushes the launch button to fire this missile, theoretically, at a Russian target in a scenario that involved Russian engagement militarily with the Baltics. So we're testing operationally the political ability to fire a nuclear warhead against a Russian target. That is literally the definition of insanity. Literally the definition. How are my Russian counterparts supposed to understand this as anything other than a direct threat to the existential survival of their nation? America is addicted to nuclear weapons. We don't know how to live without them. They're our security blanket. I can't speak for Russia. I'm sure there's people in Russia that are addicted to their nuclear deterrent as well. But I'd like to believe that the Russians will be more forthcoming in accepting the notion of total nuclear disarmament, that at least the Russians can envision the potential of that. Not minimizing the difficulty of getting there. No one's going to sit there and say this is going to be easy. But in America, we can't even think that way because Congress won't allow us to think that way, because the defense industrial complex won't allow us to think that way, because there's too much money involved. And, we might be able to get another INF treaty, because I think the danger of what's about to happen in Europe and the Pacific And I'm glad Mr. Kozin brought up the Pacific, because the United States is reconfiguring its entire military infrastructure in the Pacific to be inclusive of deep strike weapons, both conventional and nuclear, to respond to China's expansive posturing, particularly in the South China Sea and potentially against Taiwan. I mean, if I'm the Chinese, and I'm sitting there going, okay, you want to play the missile development game? We can do that. So now we're going to get in an arms race with China. We're already in an arms race with Russia. And where does this end? So I'd like to believe that at some point in time, sanity will prevail, and we can get an INF type agreement. But, we have to look at strategic weapons, because right now we have a very complicated accounting formula. It's very nuanced, and it's let's just be honest. The most dangerous weapon out there is the submarine launched ballistic missile. So why don't we get rid of the most dangerous weapon out there? Why don't we agree that there will no longer be submarine launched ballistic missile? Well, that gives away America's advantage. So we have to agree to get rid of mobile missiles, which gets rid of Russia's advantage. Yes, but now we have ground. Let's get rid of missiles in silos. Why don't we make the only nuclear weapon available to either the United States or Russia, air-launched cruise missile that's stored in a specific location at a base with specific launchers that can't move because we have inspectors there, and every time something happens, it's verified, so there's no accidents, nothing. That still gives us 400 to 600 nuclear weapons, so that if North Korea goes crazy, or Iran goes crazy, or Russia goes crazy, or we go crazy, you'll be able to have a nuclear deterrent. But there's no more missile silos that invite massive military strikes. There's no more submarine launched missiles that make everybody scared. There's no more mobile missiles that make everybody scared. It's a simple category of easily tracked missile systems that are, there's very little chance of an accident, because in order to have an accident with a air-launched cruise missile, you got to actually load it on a bomber, have the bomber take off with a human pilot who's flying a mission. There's no accident. Every one of those is a deliberate act that allows politicians to stop it. But we can't do that, because in America, we have people who are addicted to the ground-based ballistic missile. I mean, we have to have a follow-on to the Minuteman III. We have to, because we have people addicted to long-range missiles. We can't get rid of the submarines because the submarine mafia is too strong in the Pentagon. And we've created the fiction of these Trident missiles as being the ultimate deterrent. No, they're the ultimate cause of potential for future conflict, because we put a low-yield nuclear warhead on one of them and we practice launching it against the Russians. I mean, this is literally the definition of insanity. I don't mean to smile. I'm not trying to make light of it, but it scares me to death. When I think I might have told you this once, but when I grew up in Germany, West Germany. I went to high school in the 1970s. We lived next door to the largest nuclear storage facility in Europe, where the majority of American tactical nuclear weapons, the warheads, were stored. So if the balloon ever went up, that's the first place it's going to get hit, probably with a nuclear weapon. And my father was in the Air Force, and he would disappear into the bunker every now and then when there was crisis. 1979, there was constant crisis with Poland, and the fear that there could be a military conflict if Russia went into Poland. What would NATO do, et cetera? And so he would go into the bunker with no notice. So when Dad didn't come home at night, that meant there's a chance there's going to be a nuclear war tomorrow. And you literally went to school not knowing if there's going to be anything left when school ends. That's how we lived our lives day after day after day. And thank God the INF Treaty came and we got rid of that, so people didn't have to live in fear. But Europe is about ready to get the umbrella of fear brought back over it, because, if we play this stupid game and deploy Dark Eagle, the Russians are going to do something. And I'm not going to call it stupid because they have no choice, but for the sake of humanity, it's stupid. They're going to deploy a counter. And then we're going to live on this potential of a single mistake can cause the end of the world, because there's no such thing as a limited nuclear war. Maybe Mr. Kozin disagrees with me, but limited nuclear war implies that you can win a nuclear war. And I think both sides agree you can't win a nuclear war because you can't limit it. Once you start, it never stops until everything is gone. And so I'm hopeful for an INF treaty. But sadly for the Russians out there, I don't think the United States right now is capable of having the kind of responsible dialogue necessary for strategic nuclear disarmament. There has to be a change in the way that we deal with our Pentagon's budget, and that's not how we just saw now. We've increased the budget by $36 billion. Russia spends $36 billion for all of their military. We just increased our budget by what Russia spends in 1 year for all of their military. We're now spending, what, $831 billion in the upcoming budget? It's ridiculous. Sorry for rambling.
Thank you for that. Vladimir,
Yes.
your thoughts?
Well, I think that we have signed the INF Treaty in 1987 because of three factors: mutual understanding, détente. Washington put Moscow on the same level as it stood that time, and we understood that we have to resolve this issue, not to accumulate too many nuclear warheads of different classes. And that's why the INF Treaty has been signed very quickly. But the process of nuclear arms control, per se, it's a very difficult process. Sometimes delegations of the two sides sat for several years to prepare the draft treaty on limitation initially and later on reductions of strategic nuclear capabilities. So what we shall do immediately? I think the best solution for our two nations is to subscribe to no first use, while we move gradually by stages to eliminate nukes of the remaining classes, like tactical nuclear weapons and strategic offensive nuclear arms. Because this step is very easy to verify, if we agree. It requires no money to be spent or to be dragged from healthcare system, building roads and educational establishment, etc. But this kind of approach should be multilateral. All 9 nuclear weapon states should participate in this movement. I know that the task is very difficult because a number of nations in the world, they do not want to be committed to no first use or no first strike, as Americans put it. But nevertheless, we shall try and gradually to remove this kind of menace hanging over our heads each day and nights. But to understand the realities, I should stress that currently there is no good relationship between Washington and Moscow. There is a deep-seated mistrust between us. And unfortunately, the Ukrainian crisis worsened the situation existing between the USA and the Russian Federation. I would like to add some point concerning nukes and Ukrainian crisis, if I may, Regis, because too many experts in the West interpreted in the wrong way Putin's order given to Minister of Defense Shoigu and his deputy General Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov to enhance the level of readiness of Russian deterrence forces. It has not only nuclear forces, and conventional forces are included, but many people in the world interpreted this kind of enhancing the regime of operators, monitoring the developments and even how to use nukes, interpreted as if Moscow enhanced readiness of using nuclear weapons, and especially in connection with the Ukrainian crisis. But look, dear colleagues, the first one, we are not going to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine. There is no need at all. It's very close to our land. And a lot of people will die. And we are just controlling the situation and undermining the war machine of Ukraine by using simply conventional weapons. And second, you can just watch about the potential decision of the upper house of the Russian parliament, the Senate. The Senate has unique power to empower Putin as the president and commander-in-chief to use nuclear weapons. The Senate, the Russian Senate, has not given such authority, such right to Mr. Putin to use nukes at all, and in case of Ukraine. So, unfortunately, this unprofessional interpretation evoked a number of appeals, open letters from Nobel Peace Prize laureates, from ex-mayor of Hiroshima, urging us not to use nuclear weapons at all and not to use nuclear weapons versus Ukrainian armed forces. We are not going to use them. It will be suicidal act if we do this. So we will manage to undermine ultra-nationalist regime entrenched in Kiev by using conventional forces, especially long range with pinpoint accuracy, hypersonic, like Kinjal or dagger in English, like caliber or caliber in English, like onyx, bastion, etc., etc. So, Regis, we just consume a lot of time on debating nukes, but have forgotten to debate the recent Ukrainian developments. So, stockpile us with a lot of questions concerning the developments in Ukraine. Please, go ahead.
Well, I want to thank you both for a very enlightening discussion about the status of nuclear weapons, where we began and how we got here. Let's, before we conclude, if you both have a few more minutes, with your appraisal of what is happening on the ground today in Ukraine. Scott, we'll go to you first, and we'll end with Vladimir.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, you know, I only can assess what I hear about, and I'm a prisoner to American media, which is almost uniformly taking the side of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense or the Ukrainian Ministry of Information. I do read the Russian Ministry of Defense briefings, and I take that very seriously. Let me put it this way: unlike most of my counterparts here in the United States, I respect the Russian military and their professionalism. I don't view them as purveyors of disinformation. I don't view them as anything other than the professionals that they are. So I take them at face value when they say that phase one of their operations have been completed. And I take at face value how they define phase one. And as a military professional, I cannot disagree with how they've couched it. They've been very upfront. So now we come into phase two of the operation. Now, from my understanding of phase one was about a couple of three major things. One was to create a operational logistical continuity between Crimea and the southern front and the rest of Russia, meaning a land bridge. You need a land bridge so that it's for logistics, it's for maneuverability, it's for operational success. Now that can only be done if you seize Mariupol. So the capture of Mariupol was key to phase one. This can't be done if you allow a superior sized Ukrainian force, 260 to 300,000, if you include reserves, up to 600,000, freedom of maneuver. So the Russians had to, in addition to doing this, had to tie down Ukrainian forces. You do this in a couple ways. One, a fixing operation out of Donbass. That is, you have a force of 60 to 100,000 Ukrainians already concentrated in eastern Ukraine. You can't allow them to maneuver in response to your effort to create a land bridge. You need to push them back and hold them in place. So there's a major fixing operation being done by both the armed forces of Donetsk and Lugansk, supported by the Russian army. Two, you need to expand the land bridge out of Crimea and then protect. So you expand out and then you take certain areas to prevent the Ukrainians from eliminating or threatening that land base. Because it's no good to create a land bridge that connects Crimea with Russia if the Ukrainians can just cut it off with a quick attack. So you have to protect it. So that's a major supporting action. Three, you have to carry out strategic feints. One is sail the Black Sea fleet off the coast of Odessa, making the Ukrainians think that any moment you can be landing there. That means the Ukrainians have to reinforce Odessa and keep the forces in Odessa. They can't maneuver around. Two, you have a major concentration of Ukrainian capability in and around Kiev. You also have Ukrainian reserves in Western Ukraine. If you leave them alone, they can reinforce the east and disrupt your operations against Mariupol and the Donbass. So you have to carry out a major offensive feint. That is, you have to threaten Kiev. Now, Kiev is a city of 3.1 million people. Anybody who thinks that a Russian force of 40 to 50,000 men is going to capture Kiev knows some fancy military secret that I don't know. But what 50,000 men can do is threaten the lines of communication between Kiev and the rest of Ukraine, forcing the Ukrainian army to defend Kiev, to keep the forces in place and bring the reserves from the west up to Kiev. Now what the Russians have done in phase one is they fixed a major force, they've held in place other forces, and then they use long-range strike capabilities in air and helicopters to eliminate logistics, fuel, ammunition, command and control, and then to prevent the ability of the Ukrainian army to coordinate large-scale combined arms operations. There's 24 named brigades. These have been degraded to the point where they can't function in coordination with other units. That doesn't mean they're eliminated. They're still fighting. They can't function. Once this is done, Mariupol is secured, you have your land bridge. First of all, you free up around 40,000 troops that were investing in Mariupol. That's a significant offensive capability. You bring, say, another 20,000 troops out of the Kiev area. You're not retreating from Kiev. You're simply consolidating and removing, for instance, the airborne units, which are elite offensive units, and maybe elements of the First Guards Tank Army, which is an elite offensive-oriented force. You bring them down, and you can now, in phase two, carry out a pincer operation using maneuver warfare in the open plains of Ukraine. You're no longer going to be fighting for cities, and you surround the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in eastern Ukraine, who will then have to either die or surrender. And when that happens, the entire Ukrainian defense capability collapses, and it's a dramatic for the Ukrainian government. It's a dramatic reappraisal of their overall strategic position, and they may have to, at that point in time, accept terms that today are unacceptable to them. That's what I think phase two and phase three are. I don't buy into this notion that the Russian army is losing. I don't buy into this notion that the Russian army has sustained 20,000 dead. That's just a ridiculous number. First of all, that would require the Russian military to lie to the people of Russia. I mean, it's one thing for the Russians to lie to me. I'm an American, I don't matter. But to lie to the families who provide their sons for the military, this is a sacred duty, a sacred obligation. It's treated, from my experience with the Soviet Union and with Russia, this isn't something to just throw away. Because of the Great Patriotic War, the experience of World War II, so the military and the sacrifice of the soldier in combat is a sacred thing. So the idea that the Russian Ministry of Defense would deceive the mothers of Russian soldiers who are dying in combat is just beyond comprehension. In the West, we do it because we don't treat the Russians with respect. But if you know anything about the Russians, I just can't imagine that they would lie. So I take their numbers at face value. And they're not out. I mean, it's a heavy cost, but it's a realistic cost when one considers the amount of combat that's taking place right now. We haven't seen this kind of warfare between modern equipped forces since the only equivalent is the Second World War. It didn't even happen in the Gulf War because we're fighting against a severely degraded Iraqi military. The Ukrainian military, understand, was trained to NATO standards, equipped with NATO equipment. Their leaders were trained in NATO tactics. They used NATO communications. So Russia is fighting, for all intents and purposes, a NATO force, and they're beating them. They're beating them. Not badly. What I mean by that is it's not. The Ukrainians know how to fight, and they're putting up a fight. They're fighting very hard. They're fighting very brave. I'm not denigrating the Ukrainians at all. Professionally, I give them a tip of the hat. But they're going up against a military that has a very good plan, has thought out what they're doing strategically, and has nullified any advantage that the Ukrainians have. The Ukrainians can win a tactical battle here, there, but they're not winning the operational fight, and they're not winning the strategic fight. And I think this shift from phase 1 to phase 2 is proof of that. The fact that it's going as slow as it is because I believe the Russians are disregarding their normal doctrine of overwhelming fire support and mass in favor of a very measured approach designed to save civilian life and civilian infrastructure. I mean, there's horrible things taking place because that's war. But anytime a civilian site is being destroyed, I think it's because the Ukrainians have put military forces there and turned it into a viable military target. And even then, I believe the Russians are coming in with a very measured response. It's my assessment that hundreds of Russian soldiers have died because of the way Russia is approaching this fight. That Russia is compelled to put soldiers' lives at risk in order to save Ukrainian civilians and preserve Ukrainian infrastructure. And the fact that the West can't understand the honor and the sacrifice that's entailed in taking that approach, because you're asking Russian soldiers to die in order to save Ukrainian civilians' lives. And that's just the most noble of sacrifice. I'm not going to sit here and say that, I support Russia's operations, No, I wish there wasn't a war. I wish there would have been a way to find out to prevent this war. But since the war has started, I can find no fault with how Russia has carried out this mission. And I have confidence that they will continue to behave in a manner that's consistent with international humanitarian law and the law of war, and seek to the best of their ability to preserve civilian life and civilian property. And I'll leave you with this: military math. In the history of war, the combatant to civilian death ratio is generally 1-to-1. That is, for every civilian that dies in a conflict, there's generally a combatant that dies. You go and look at the numbers, it comes out roughly to 1-to-1. Right now, if you take the Russian figures of approximately 1,500 Russian dead and approximately 14,000 Ukrainian dead, we're operating at 15,500 dead combatants. It's probably gone up since the last time the numbers were there. But if you take, the most liberal figures, let's say we call it 5,000 dead civilians. I don't think there's that many, but I don't know. Mariupol is a very dangerous fight. Let's say 5,000 dead civilians. That's a 3-to-1 combatant to civilian ratio. And that 3-1 is happening not because the Ukrainians are doing anything to prevent the loss of civilian life. Actually, the Ukrainians are doing everything to get civilians killed. There's a Washington Post article this morning that all but they can't, they don't have the courage to call Ukrainians war criminals, but it is a war crime to have human shields. It is a war crime to put military equipment next to civilian infrastructure. And the Ukrainians are doing that so flagrantly that even the Washington Post has to call them out. And despite this, the civilian to military death ratio is 3-1. That means the Russians are bending over backwards not to kill Ukrainian civilians. And that's a reality I think the West needs to start to appreciate more. It doesn't mean you support what Russia's doing. It doesn't mean that you're anti-Ukraine. But it means that you have the integrity to say that the Russians, even if you disagree with why they're in Ukraine, they are behaving honorably and consistent with the laws of war, that they are not war criminals. And to have our president run around and call the Russian leader a war criminal just is a display of, hubris-laced ignorance that I can't support. Again, I'm not sitting here saying that I support what Russia's doing. I'm not flying the Russian flag. What I am saying, though, is what Russia is doing is comport with the laws of war, and the Russian soldiers are carrying out a very difficult mission that I may or may not agree with, but they're carrying it out honorably, and they shouldn't be denigrated by calling them anything less than the professionals that they are.
Wow. Vladimir.
Yeah. Well, the reasons that we started the military operation versus Ukraine was obvious to us, because for the last nearly 8 years, Kiev violated the Minsk Accord we have signed in 2015. All provisions, all 13 provisions of the Minsk Treaty, except one, exchanging of prisoners of war, but only partially, not totally. Second, we anticipated that Kiev would like to launch a major offensive against Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. It actually started earlier than we just began our military drive into Ukraine. It started on from February 14th till 17th, and we have seen exodus of civilians coming to the Russian territory in huge numbers. Kiev and President Zelensky, nourished and very well backed by NATO countries, wanted to begin a large-scale operation against Donbass on the 8th of March of this year. And we certainly just made a kind of preventive attack, because we still remember, and we cannot forget this, that during the first aggressions launched by Ukraine versus Donbass in 2014, the first one, and in 2015, the second one, and the third this year, 14,000 civilians have been killed, and 36,000 civilians in Donbass have been killed. And still, despite our drive in the heartland of Ukraine, nationalistic battalions and Ukrainian regular armed forces, day in, day out, shell Donbass and civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk republics by using heavy artillery, 122 millimeters howitzers and artillery pieces, 120 millimeters mortars, tanks, and multiple rocket launching systems like Grad of the Soviet and Russian made. we are just again losing civilian lives. And what is also unlucky to them, that civilian infrastructure is heavily destroyed when we are talking to each other. So that's why we are just confirmed that our decision was justified. Later, we understand that 35 biological weapons laboratories have been created with the help of Pentagon, and finally it was discovered by Daily Mail, and material obtained in the notebook that belonged to Hunter Biden, the son of Joseph Biden, that he also just gave his money for the development of highly virulent diseases like anthrax, tularemia, whatnot, especially using birds and bats against us and against the states who are in the collective security treaty organization. Another factor was that Mr. Zelensky, addressing the Munich Security Conference, openly in the public said that he would like to acquire nuclear capabilities. And the United States of America much earlier gave to Kiev weapon-grade plutonium to create its national nuclear forces. That was completely unacceptable. And they also asked openly to get the American THAAD, Theater High Altitude Area Defense, and a lot of arms and ammunition. Even neutral Sweden supplies Kiev with anti-tank grenade launchers AT-4, and some others like the United States Javelin, and the UK NLAW, etc. So we will continue our operation. Today we've got a very interesting piece of news that came from Istanbul, where the fourth round of bilateral talks between Russian and Ukrainian official delegations sat together. We reduced, as it was announced, the Russian Federation, we reduced the activity tempo in the direction towards Kiev and Chernihiv, also the big city in Ukraine. I don't know what will be the result, because it was announced by the deputy head of our delegation, Mr. Fomin, who is Colonel General of the Russian Armed Forces and deputy the head of the delegation. The head of delegation is a civilian person, Mr. Medinsky, ex-Minister of Culture of the Russian Federation. But we have seen that Ukrainian delegation is following zigzagging path at this negotiation. But we cannot accept this kind of thing. If they threaten again to Donbass or to us because of Crimean factor, or just threaten with nukes or biological or bacteriological and toxic weapons, we will not agree to any rapprochement at the negotiation table with the Ukrainians. But we have specified two major goals: to demilitarize and to denazify Ukrainian society. The first task, demilitarization, is coming to an end very quickly during slightly more than 1 month of our operation, because Kiev doesn't have navy anymore, completely ruined, destroyed, practically no air force, practically no anti-aircraft defense system, and certainly they have soldiers and officers and territorial defense people, reservists, etc. Unfortunately, if the United States and NATO were much smarter and clever, they would have advised Mr. Zelensky that please sign a peace deal with Russia. Avoid all these fascist groupings like Azov, Right Sector, Donbass, etc., Tornado, and do not apply for NATO membership for good. So be as a non-aligned country, not neutral, because Finland is neutral. It's not a member of the NATO alliance. But recently, Finland ordered 64 fifth generation fighter bomber F-35 with letter A. Alpha means nuclear capable, dual capable aircraft. Neutral Finland. So, in our judgment, Kiev should be friendly, normal state, a good neighbor of the Russian Federation, and we should be the same kind of state, a good neighbor to Kiev. To Ukrainians, we have plenty of families with entangled family ties, religious connections, cultural connections as well. And let's again, I put my fingers crossed and touch the wood that the sooner we will agree to major peace deal on the basis of rationality and reason and wisdom, it will be the best solution for our two nations, Ukrainians and Russians, the citizens of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. But I'm very proud of the Russian soldiers and officers who sacrificed their lives, right you are, Scott, to protect Ukrainian civilians, to share with them humanitarian assistance, to put their bodies, to hide them from shelling, from automatic bursts of the opposite side. We are just very angry that Ukrainian soldiers tortured Russian prisoners of war, shoot their legs and cut their throats. We will never have done this. We will never do this. We have not done this at all. We understand and we honor the war rules and how to fight. We never used civilians as a human shield. And but nevertheless, all people responsible for such atrocities will be apprehended and put behind the bars. And those who just were like Frankenstein, they will perish in the front, no doubt, no doubt. And thank you, guys, for your time, for your just positive notes and understanding of the situation. God bless you all. God bless our two giant and powerful countries. We should live together as comrades in arms and comrades without nuclear arms and weapons of mass destruction. We have many common things. We have many common things to follow, to expand them and to exchange human contacts and I'm looking forward to talk to you anytime you so desire. Absolute, without any hesitation. Thank you very much. Very much. God bless you all.
And thank you, Vladimir. Scott, any
Thank you.
concluding thoughts?
No, I think Vladimir hit it all. I'm on board completely, and I thank you both for giving me the opportunity to speak with you. It's a pleasure to meet Mr. Kozin, and I hope we can continue this dialogue either through the vehicle of Zoom or maybe hopefully someday in person.
Scott, I will be delighted if you call me Vladimir.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Like Regis, Vladimir, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, goodbye. Take care. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye. Cheers.